She found a dying man in the snow and chose to save him instead of letting him die so her children could eat. What happened next changed everything. A widow, two starving children, one brutal Colorado winter, and a stranger whose gold watch was worth more than everything she owned. Maeve Callahan had exactly three choices: walk away and let him freeze, take his valuables and leave, or drag him home and risk her family's survival on a man she didn't know. Most people would have taken the watch and never looked back. Maeve made the hardest choice of all. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the very end, because nothing about this story goes the way you think it will. The flour was almost gone. Maeve Callahan had been rationing it since the second week of November, cutting the biscuits smaller and smaller until they were barely worth the effort of baking. Pale, thin discs that her children ate without complaint, because they had learned, somewhere along the way, that complaining didn't fill a stomach. She measured what remained by running her fingers along the bottom of the sack each morning, feeling the thin layer of white powder that clung to the rough burlap, and she had become so practiced at this particular arithmetic of desperation that she no longer needed to think about it consciously. Her hands did the math before her mind caught up. 3 days, maybe 4 if she stretched it. The cabin sat at the edge of a narrow valley carved out by a creek that was now frozen solid under 18 inches of ice. 3 years ago, when Daniel was still alive and the world was still shaped the way she'd expected it to be, this had been a beautiful piece of land. She remembered standing in the doorway that first autumn, watching the aspens turn gold against the gray granite of the mountains, feeling something close to contentment. Daniel had put his arm around her shoulders and said, "We're going to build something here, Maeve. Something real." He was dead before the second winter. Pneumonia, fast and merciless. He'd been cutting firewood, sweating through his shirt in the cold, and by the time she understood what was happening, it was already too late. The sickness moved through him like a fire through dry grass, and she sat beside him for 4 days watching him burn from the inside out, listening to his chest make sounds no chest should make. And then one morning she woke to silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't end. She was 28 years old. She had $7, a half cord of wood, and 2 children. Thomas, who was 9 and already wore his father's face with an uncomfortable accuracy, and Clara, who was 6 and still asked sometimes, not often but sometimes, when Papa was coming home. That had been 2 years ago, 2 winters, and she had survived both of them through a combination of stubbornness, careful planning, and occasional grace. A neighbor 15 miles east named Hector Beaumont, who sometimes sent his hired hand over with a sack of cornmeal, a good summer garden that she'd worked until her hands cracked and bled, a single elk that Thomas had helped her bring down in October, more luck than skill, an animal that had practically walked into her rifle sights as if it had made a decision. The salted meat from that elk had kept them through November. But the elk was gone now. The garden was buried under 2 feet of snow. Hector Beaumont had sent word through his hired hand in early December that his own family was struggling, that he was sorry, that he hoped the spring came early. It was December 21st, the longest night of the year, and Maeve was standing in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, her breath making small clouds in the air because the fire had burned down to coals overnight, counting flour and trying to figure out how to make mathematics work in her favor for once. 3 days, she thought. 4 if I'm careful. And then, what? She didn't let herself finish the thought. She had learned that particular discipline too. You didn't look too far ahead. You solved today's problem and tomorrow's problem, and you kept your eyes on the ground directly in front of you because the horizon was too far away and too uncertain to spend energy on. She rebuilt the fire. She listened to the wind work itself against the cabin walls, a sound like something trying to get in, patient and persistent. She put the kettle on. She stood in the orange light of the growing fire and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of everything. Then she stopped. She put the feeling away in whatever place she kept it. She went to wake the children. Thomas was already awake when she opened the door to the small back room where he and Clara slept side by side under a pile of quilts. He was lying on his back with his eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, and he turned his head when she came in with the candle. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She reached down and touched his forehead out of habit, checking for fever, always checking, always afraid, and found it cool and dry. "Sleep all right?" "Fine." He sat up. He didn't say he was cold, though she could see in the set of his jaw that he was. I was thinking about the snares. Don't. Mama. The temperature dropped 30 degrees last night, Thomas. There's nothing in those snares. She turned to Clara, who was burrowed so deep under the quilts that only a tuft of dark hair showed. Clara, time to get up, sweetheart. A groan, a long pause. Then Clara emerged, round-faced and sleepy, looking so much like Daniel that Maeve had to look away for half a second to collect herself. Is it morning? Clara said. It's morning. It doesn't feel like morning. It never does. She got them up and fed them the biscuits. Thin ones, small ones, with the last of the winter preserves spread carefully across the surface. Thomas looked at his portion and said nothing. Clara ate hers in 4 bites and looked around hopefully for more. Maeve gave her the rest of her own biscuit and claimed she wasn't hungry, and Thomas watched this with eyes that were too old for his face and said nothing about that either. After breakfast, Maeve put on her coat. It was a man's coat, Daniel's coat, heavy canvas lined with wool that she'd repaired so many times that the patches had patches. It hung past her hips and the sleeves were too long, and it was the warmest thing she owned. She pulled on her boots, her gloves, her scarf. I'm going down to check the creek, she said. Stay inside, keep the fire up. I can come, Thomas said. You stay with your sister. Mama, I can... Thomas. She looked at him. He looked back. He was 9 years old, and he was already trying to take care of her, which was the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever seen. I need you here. Please. He sat back down. All right. The cold outside the cabin door was a different category of cold, not the kind that made you uncomfortable, the kind that made you feel like the world was actively hostile to your presence in it. A deep, bone-specific cold that found every gap in your clothing and worked its way through, methodical and unhurried. The temperature was somewhere below 0. She didn't know exactly how far below. Far enough. The snow was crusted over from the freeze, hard enough in places to walk on top of, soft enough in others to break through to her knee. She moved carefully, testing each step, picking her way through the trees that separated the cabin from the creek bottom. The sky was still dark in the west, but beginning to pale in the east, a gray that would become pink, that would become the flat white light of a winter day with no warmth in it. The world was completely still. Not peaceful. She was past the point of finding winter stillness peaceful. Just still. Empty. The kind of silence that reminded her how far she was from anyone. The creek was a white scar in the valley floor, impossible to distinguish from the snow around it except for the slight depression in the landscape. She walked along its bank, checking the lines she'd set for fish. Hooks baited with scraps of meat dropped through holes she'd chopped in the ice. She'd set 6 lines 3 days ago. 5 of them were frozen solid, the holes sealed over with new ice, the lines locked in place. She checked them one by one, chipping at the ice with the small hand axe she carried, freeing the lines, pulling them up. Nothing. 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 She stopped at the 6th hole, which was partially open, and felt a faint stirring of hope. She pulled the line carefully. For a moment there was resistance, and her heart lifted. And then the resistance resolved into a snag, just a root or a rock on the creek bottom, and she freed it and pulled the line up, and there was nothing on the hook but the frozen remnant of the bait. She stood there for a moment. Think, she told herself. Don't feel. Think. She could try to shoot something, but the ammunition was limited. She had 14 shells for the rifle, and game had been scarce. She could dig deeper into the root cellar, but she knew what was in the root cellar. She had inventoried it so many times it was memorized. 3 jars of pickled beets, 1 jar of apple preserves, already half empty, a small sack of dried beans. That was it. She needed to find something, today, not tomorrow. Today. She turned to follow the creek bank further east, where it bent around a stand of cottonwoods she hadn't checked in a while. Sometimes game moved through that area. Rabbits, occasionally a deer. It was worth looking. She was halfway through the cottonwoods when she saw the shape. She almost walked past it. The light was still low and the shape was half buried in snow, and at first her brain filed it under fallen log and moved on. But something, some instinct she couldn't name, made her stop and look again. Not a log, too irregular, wrong color. She moved closer. Her breath was very loud in the silence. It was a man. He was lying face down in the snow at the base of a cottonwood, one arm extended as if he'd been trying to reach for the tree trunk. He was wearing a heavy fur coat that had been white with snow long enough to suggest he'd been there for hours, possibly since the previous night. One of his boots was missing. His hat was gone. The side of his head that she could see was dark with dried blood that had frozen against his temple and matted in his gray-shot hair. Maeve stood absolutely still for 3 full seconds. Then she knelt beside him and pressed her fingers to the side of his neck. There was a pulse, weak and slow, but there. He was alive. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. And then, because she was not a woman who spent much time on prayers when she could spend it on action, she pulled off her glove and pressed her bare palm against his cheek. Cold. Too cold. He'd been out here long enough that cold wasn't a temporary condition for him. It had become his condition, the state of his body, something that would kill him if it hadn't already begun to. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was a big man. 6 feet or close to it, broad through the shoulders, heavy in the way that came from muscle and a certain kind of life. The fur coat alone must have weighed 30 pounds. She was 5'4" and hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. She thought about what it would cost her to bring him back. The firewood to heat the cabin for 2 people instead of 3. No, for 4. The food she would have to stretch further. The time spent nursing a stranger instead of working on the 100 tasks that kept her family alive. And then, because she was practical in the way that only genuine desperation makes you, she thought about what he might be carrying. She reached into his coat. His pockets were deep, and she had to dig through the frozen fabric to find them. The first one held a folded piece of paper that might be a map, too stiff to unfold without tearing. The second held a small knife in a leather sheath. The third held a handful of .44 caliber cartridges, and at these she felt something she wasn't proud of. A surge of relief that was almost physical, because 14 shells was not enough, and these cartridges meant more, meant the possibility of a deer, of food. She almost stopped there, almost convinced herself that was enough. Take the cartridges and the knife and whatever else he had, and walk back to the cabin and let him finish what the cold had started. No one would know. He would have been dead before she found him, practically. She was just being accurate about the timeline. Her hand found the watch. It was in an inside pocket, close to his chest. A gold watch, heavy and warm from being pressed against his body even in the cold, on a chain that was also gold. She pulled it free and turned it in her hands. The case was engraved with a pattern she couldn't make out in the low light. She pried it open. Inside, the face was white enamel with black Roman numerals. The hands were stopped at 1147, and engraved on the inside of the case, in small, precise lettering, were the words, "To Silas, who makes things worth building." She turned the watch over. The case back was also engraved, S.B., Denver, 1879. Maeve sat in the snow with the dead man's watch in her hand, except he wasn't dead, not yet, which was the problem. And she thought about her 3 days of flour, her 3 jars of pickled beets, her 2 children, and the way Thomas tried not to look hungry because he thought it would worry her. This watch was worth more than everything she owned combined. A watch like this, in a town, could buy a month of provisions. 2 months. It could see them through to spring. She looked at the man's face, the blood frozen at his temple, the particular stillness of someone who had given up or been given no choice. "Damn," she said quietly. To no one. She put the watch in her own pocket, then she grabbed the man by the arm and started dragging him home. She couldn't drag him through the snow. She got about 40 feet before she understood that, before her boots broke through the crust for the 3rd time, and she went down on one knee in snow to her thigh, and the man's dead weight kept moving, and she had to grab a tree to stop herself from going completely over. She stopped. She breathed. Her lungs ached from the cold. "Think," she said out loud, because sometimes it helped to say things out loud. The cabin was 300 yards, maybe 350, uphill, through the cottonwoods, across the open stretch of meadow. The snow in the meadow was wind-packed, and she might be able to walk on top of it if she moved carefully, but the cottonwood grove was drifted deep and unpredictable. She needed something to put him on. She went back to the cabin at a pace that was between walking and running, broke through the ice twice, and went down once. Came up with snow packed into her boot. Thomas was at the window when she came across the meadow, and she could see his face, the sudden alertness, the relief at seeing her, then the concern at how she was moving. He met her at the door. "What happened? Are you—" "I need the sled," she said. "The big one." He blinked. "The sled? Why do you—" "Thomas, the sled, please." He got it without another question. It was stored in the lean-to beside the cabin, a heavy wooden drag sled that Daniel had built for hauling firewood, 4 feet long with rope handles at both ends. She grabbed a blanket from inside, the one she'd been saving for emergencies. She supposed this counted. "There's a man," she said, because Thomas deserved an explanation. "Hurt, down by the cottonwoods. I'm going to bring him in." Thomas stared at her. "A man? Who is he?" "I don't know." "Is he bad hurt?" "Bad enough." Her son was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing this the way he processed everything, carefully, with a seriousness that she sometimes found heartbreaking and sometimes found invaluable. Then he said, "I'll come with you." She started to say no. Then she looked at the sled and thought about 300 yards of rough snow and said, "Put your boots on. Don't wake your sister." They got him on the sled by rolling him. There was no elegant way to do it. Maeve grabbed his coat, and Thomas grabbed his legs, and they heaved, and the man rolled onto the blanket she'd spread on the sled with a dead thump that made Thomas flinch. Maeve checked for the pulse again, still there, slower. "Who do you think he is?" Thomas asked. "I don't know." "How'd he get hurt?" "I don't know that either." She was straightening the man's limbs, trying to make sure he was stable on the sled, not looking at Thomas when she said it. "There's blood on his head." "I see it." "Did someone hurt him, or did he fall?" Maeve paused. She looked at the man's coat more carefully, now that she could see it properly in the growing light. The fur was matted, not just with snow, but with something darker in places. Not just the blood from his head. She looked at the left side of his torso, and she could see, if she looked carefully, where the fabric of the coat beneath the fur was dark and stiff. More blood. A lot of it. Not from his head. "Both, maybe," she said. Come on, grab the rope." Getting him up the slope through the cottonwoods was the hardest thing she'd done since Daniel died. The sled kept catching on roots and brush under the snow, and the man was heavy, genuinely heavy. Not just coat heavy, but big-boned and solid in a way that didn't change with circumstance. She and Thomas pulled together, found a rhythm, lost it, found it again. Thomas went down once, and she hauled him up by the back of his coat without stopping. They didn't talk. There wasn't breath for talking. By the time they broke out of the cottonwoods into the meadow, her arms were shaking. The wind had picked up and was cutting across the open ground, finding her face above her scarf and the exposed skin of her wrists where her gloves didn't quite meet her sleeves. "Almost there," Thomas said. He wasn't saying it for her benefit. He was saying it for his own. She understood that. "Almost there," she agreed. Clara was awake when they came through the door, standing in the middle of the cabin with her dark hair loose and her eyes wide, and she took one look at what her mother and brother were dragging across the threshold and said, in a voice that was utterly calm, "Is he dead?" "Not yet," Maeve said. "Oh," Clara said. Then, "Should I move my doll?" It took Maeve a moment to understand what she meant. Clara's rag doll was on the cot by the fire, the cot they kept there for when one of the children was sick. "Yes, move your doll." They got him onto this cot. Maeve checked the blood at his side, cutting away his coat and the shirt beneath it with her kitchen knife. There was no time for careful, and found what she'd feared. A knife wound, long and deep along the left side of his ribs. It had stopped bleeding, sealed over with cold and clotted blood, but it would start again when he warmed up. She'd seen knife wounds before. Her father had been a field surgeon's assistant during the war, before she was born, and he'd described things in enough clinical detail that she had always had a thorough, if second-hand, understanding of what the body could survive and what it couldn't. This wound was serious, but probably not mortal if she dealt with it right. Probably. "Thomas," she said, "I need you to boil water, as much as you can." "All right." He was already moving. "Clara, I need you to stay out of the way. Can you do that for me?" "I can help," Clara said. "I know you can. Right now helping means staying out of the way." She looked at her daughter, the serious dark eyes, the set of the jaw that was Daniel's jaw, and felt a stab of something that wasn't quite fear but was related to it. Okay? Okay, Clara said. She climbed up onto the big bed and sat cross-legged, watching with the focused attention of a child who was storing things up. Maeve went to work. She cleaned the wound with the hottest water Thomas brought her. The man stirred when she did it, the first sign of real consciousness, and made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and something more animal. She leaned her weight on his shoulder to keep him still. Easy, she said. You're inside. You're safe. Be still. He didn't respond to the words, but he went still. She wasn't sure if that was understanding or just the body running out of the energy to fight. She stitched the wound with thread from her sewing kit and a curved needle she kept in a small tin that had belonged to her mother, whose own history of making do had been substantial and practical. The stitching was not beautiful, but it was thorough. She'd stitched a cut above Thomas's eyebrow 2 winters ago when he'd fallen on the ice, and she'd stitched her own hand once, working by feel in a mirror when she'd been careless with an axe. She could do this. The wound at his head was less critical than it looked. Head wounds bled aggressively even when they weren't deep, and this one had stopped bleeding on its own. She cleaned it, wrapped it with a strip of cloth. She checked his feet. The bare one, he'd lost the boot somewhere in the snow, was white and waxy in a way that told her he'd had frostbite at minimum. She put both feet in lukewarm water, not hot, and let them come up to temperature slowly. There was nothing else to do for them. Then she sat back and looked at the man. He was in his mid-40s, she thought. Maybe a hard-lived 40 or a well-preserved 50. Difficult to say. His hair was dark with gray working through it at the temples, cut short but grown out a few weeks past a recent cut. His face was angular, weathered in the specific way of men who spent their lives outdoors. Deep lines around the mouth and eyes, skin that had seen too much sun and wind. Even unconscious, his face held a kind of tension, a tightness around the jaw that suggested someone who didn't relax easily. He wasn't a trapper. His hands were wrong for it. She checked them while warming his fingers, and they were calloused, but not in the places a man who worked with hides and traps would be calloused. More like someone who rode horses regularly. The boots, the one remaining boot, were expensive, she noticed. Not frontier-made. Custom-made, good leather, city-made quality. Who was he? And what had happened to him? She thought about the knife wound and the blood on his head. Those didn't happen in a fall. Someone had done that to him deliberately and left him in the snow to finish the job the cold would start. She thought about the gold watch. She went to her coat, which was hanging by the door, and took the watch from the pocket. She turned it over in her hands again. To Silas, who makes things worth building. S.B. Silas. Silas something. She held the watch for a moment. Then she went and set it on the shelf above the fireplace, in plain sight, where she wouldn't be tempted to think of it as anything other than what it was. His, not hers. He burned through the night. Maeve had expected the fever, had prepared herself for it, or tried to. When the body starts coming back from the cold, it throws heat at the problem. And if there's infection underneath, then the heat doesn't stop. It builds. By nightfall, the man was running a temperature she could feel from 6 inches away, his skin flushed and dry and radiating, and he was talking in the delirious way that people talked when the fever got its hooks in, words and pieces of words, not making sense, not in any order. She caught fragments, not the East Track. Not the East Track. And Hendricks, I told you. And once, clearly a woman's name that she didn't recognize, said with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything else about him. She and the children slept in shifts. Or she slept in shifts. Thomas was supposed to be sleeping, but she caught him awake twice in the night, sitting up in the dark, watching the man on the cot with an expression she recognized because she wore it herself. Vigilance. The habitual alertness of someone who'd learned you couldn't afford to fully let your guard down. Go to sleep, she told him. I'm not tired, he said. Thomas. He lay back down. She wasn't sure he slept. She used the last of her medicinal supplies that night, a small packet of willow bark that she'd been hoarding since October, intended for emergencies. She brewed it as tea and managed to get some of it down the man's throat, and she thought maybe it helped, though it was hard to say. The fever raged through the small hours, and she sat beside the cot and watched it, and could do nothing but watch. Just before dawn, it broke. Not dramatically, not with any sign or signal. One moment she was half dozing in the chair beside him, and the next she became aware that the room felt different. The quality of his breathing had changed, had slowed and deepened, had lost that shallow, ragged quality. She reached over and touched his forehead. Damp, cooler. She let out a breath she'd been holding for hours. "All right," she said quietly. To him, or to herself, or to the room. "All right." In the morning, she took stock. The man had been in the cabin for one night. In that one night, she had used most of the firewood she'd planned to spread across 3 days, her entire supply of willow bark, the better part of a jar of the pickled beets fed to the children for dinner because she'd been too occupied with him to cook anything properly. She needed to cut more wood. She needed to go back to the snares she'd set further up the valley that she hadn't checked in 2 days. She needed to do approximately 10 things that had nothing to do with a stranger on her cot, and she needed to do them today. She made the children biscuits, smaller than yesterday's, thin as paper, and told Thomas what needed doing in the order it needed doing, and she trusted him to do most of it because she had no choice but to trust him. He was 9. He had been doing this work for 2 years. The stranger slept through the morning. He stirred around midday, and she saw his eyes open briefly. Dark eyes, not entirely focused. And she came to the edge of the cot and said, "You're inside. You're safe. Don't try to move." He looked at her without recognition. His mouth moved. "Don't try to talk either," she said. "Later." He seemed to accept this. His eyes drifted shut again. She went back to her work. There was always work. He was truly conscious by the second afternoon. She knew it before he said anything because the quality of his stillness changed. The unconscious body has a particular heaviness, a passivity, that's absent the moment the mind reconnects to it. She was skinning 2 rabbits that Thomas had brought in from the traps. Not much, but something, enough for a thin stew that would last 2 days if she was careful. And she heard a shift in the breathing from across the room and looked over. He was watching her, not with confusion, not with the vague, unfocused look of someone still fever-caught. He was watching her with clear, steady attention, taking in the cabin, the children at the table, the fire, her at her work, in the methodical way of someone doing a quick but thorough assessment. She set down the rabbit. "You're awake," she said. "Appears so," he said. His voice was rough from disuse and dehydration, and the words came out slowly, but they were clear. He tried to push himself up and stopped, his face going tight with pain. His hand went to his ribs. "Don't," she said. He didn't. He let himself back down, breathing carefully. "How bad?" "Knife wound, 7 stitches. You'll live if you don't tear them." Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it. "How long?" "This is the 2nd day." He turned his head, taking in more of the room. He looked at Thomas and Clara, who were both watching him with the frank curiosity of children who hadn't learned yet that staring was impolite. Thomas had apparently given up any pretense of being occupied with anything other than the stranger. Clara had her rag doll pressed to her chest and was looking at the man with an expression of serious evaluation. "Your children," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "And you found me, down by the creek. You'd been there most of the night, I think." He absorbed this. "You dragged me back." "My son helped." He looked at Thomas again. Thomas met his gaze steadily, and something in the man's expression shifted. A faint acknowledgement of something, a recognition of seriousness. "How far?" 300 yards, give or take. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You should have left me." "That option was considered," Maeve said, and went back to the rabbit. She heard him make a small sound that might, in another man, in different circumstances, have been a laugh. His name was Silas Blackridge. He told her that on the 3rd day, when he was sitting up against the wall with a bowl of rabbit stew balanced on his knees, and enough color back in his face that he no longer looked like a man practicing to be a corpse. He said it carefully, as if he was deciding something in the moment of saying it. "Maeve Callahan," she replied. She was mending a shirt at the table, Thomas beside her working on a length of rope he was rebraiding, Clara asleep in the back room. "And before you ask, yes, I found the watch. It's on the shelf. It's been there the whole time. So has everything else I found in your pockets." He turned to look at the shelf. The watch sat there, gold and visible, the way she'd placed it. He was quiet for a moment. "The ammunition too?" he said. "In the tin beside the watch." Another silence, this one with a different quality. "Most people," he said, "given what I imagine your situation is, wouldn't have done that." "I'm not most people." "No, I'm beginning to understand that." He looked at her steadily. "What is your situation?" She kept her eyes on her mending. "What makes you think that's your business?" "You have rabbit stew made from 2 rabbits feeding 4 people," he said. "The biscuits this morning were the size of my thumbnail. Your son came in from 2 hours of cold this morning without complaining and without looking at you to see if you noticed, which means he's been trained out of complaining, which means there's been a reason to train it out of him. I may have been unconscious for 2 days, but I'm not stupid." She set down the shirt and looked at him. He was watching her with the same steady attentiveness he'd had since he woke up. There was something unsettling about it, not threatening exactly, but the gaze of someone who was accustomed to reading situations accurately and had no particular incentive to be polite about what he read. Thomas had stopped rebraiding the rope and was watching the exchange with interest. "My husband died 2 years ago," Maeve said. She kept her voice flat and factual. "We've been running short since October. The cold's been bad and the game's been scarce, and I have maybe 2 days of flour left." She picked up the shirt again. "Now you know. And you still brought me in. I told you what I considered." "You did." He turned the stew bowl in his hands. "I have money." "Good for you." "Mrs. Callahan, I don't need your money, Mr. Blackridge." She stopped, aware of how ridiculous that was given what she'd just told him, and felt something that in other circumstances might have been funny. Not as a transaction. "I wasn't offering charity." "Then what were you offering?" He seemed to consider this. "Honesty. I have means to help, and you need help. The arrangement doesn't need a name." "Everything needs a name," Maeve said. "Otherwise you don't know what you're agreeing to." Thomas made a small sound. She glanced at him, and he immediately looked down at the rope with exaggerated focus. Silas looked at the boy. "Your son doesn't miss much," he said. "No," she said. "He doesn't. Shot." On the 4th day, Silas tried to stand up and made it as far as the middle of the cabin floor before his legs gave out and he went down on one knee, catching himself on the edge of the table. Maeve, who had been heating water at the fire, turned around at the sound. She didn't rush to help him. She watched him work it out, watched him breathe through the pain, get his feet under him, straighten. He was sweating by the time he was upright, and his face was the color of old ash, but he was upright. "Impressive," she said. "Very nearly stood up without dying." "Thank you," he said through his teeth. "That's helpful. I'll remember that for next time." She went back to the water. "Sit down before you fall down and undo 7 stitches." He made his way back to the cot. She could hear in his footsteps the effort it cost him. "How long before I can move properly?" "A week, if you're careful. Longer if you're not." "I can't stay a week." She turned around. "Where exactly do you plan to go?" He said nothing. "There's 2 feet of snow on the ground, and whatever did that to your ribs is still out there somewhere," she said. "If you walk out that door in the next 3 days, you'll be back in the snow inside of an hour, and this time I won't go looking. You looked last time." "I didn't know you last time." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted into something more careful. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Callahan?" "It's geography," she said. "The facts of the situation. Stay if you need to stay. Go when you can safely go. Don't make it more complicated than that." He was quiet for a while. Then, "You're a very direct woman." "I'm an efficient one," she said. "There's a difference. Direct implies I have opinions about things. I have opinions about some things. Mostly I just don't have time to be indirect." He almost smiled. Just almost. It was enough to change his face entirely, briefly, into something that looked like a different person from the one who'd arrived half dead on her cot. Something younger, less armored. Then it was gone. "All right," he said. "A week." Oh, Clara warmed to him first. This was partly temperament. Clara warmed to most things, animals and strangers and stray ideas, and partly because Silas, for a man who projected an air of fairly comprehensive self-sufficiency, turned out to be good with children in a way Maeve hadn't anticipated. It started on the 5th day when Clara approached the cot with her rag doll pressed to her chest and said, in her most formal voice. "What's your name?" "Silas," he said. "That's an old-fashioned name." "It was an old-fashioned time when I got it." Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to most considerations. "My doll's name is Marie," she said. "Do you want to see her?" Maeve started. "Sure," Silas said. Clara held up the doll, which was a ragbag collection of cloth and yarn hair and button eyes that had been repaired and re-repaired over 3 years. Silas looked at it with genuine attention. "Marie," he said. "That's a good name for her." "She got wet last winter, and Mama sewed her eye back on," Clara said. "You can see where it's different. This one," she pointed to the left button eye, "is a little bigger. Mama couldn't find the same size." "You'd hardly notice," Silas said. "She looks fine." "She looks fine because she is fine," Clara said with some dignity. "Different isn't broken." A pause. "No," he said. "It's not." Maeve, who had been listening from the fire, bent her head over her work. "What?" Thomas was slower. Thomas watched the man from a careful distance, taking in things, filing them away. On the 6th day, he asked Silas, straight out, the way he asked everything. "Who hurt you?" Silas looked at the boy for a moment. "Some men who wanted something I had." "Did they get it?" "No." "Will they try again?" A pause. "Probably." Thomas nodded, receiving this information seriously. "Does my mother know that?" Maeve at the table said, "Your mother is standing 5 feet away and has ears." Thomas didn't look away from Silas. Silas held the boy's gaze with something that looked to Maeve like respect. "She knows now," Silas said. "All right," Thomas said. He went back to whatever he'd been doing, like it was simple, like that was enough information. Maeve met Silas's eyes across the room. He looked away first, and she noticed that, and filed it away, and said nothing about it. On the 7th night, after the children were in bed, Maeve was sitting by the fire doing the arithmetic she did every night. 2 days of flour. Maybe 3 if she was very careful. The rabbits from Thomas's traps. Intermittent, unreliable. The dried beans, enough for a week of supplementing, no more. Silas was awake on the cot. She knew it. She'd learned the difference between his sleeping stillness and his awake stillness. "The flour runs out in 3 days, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe because she was tired of carrying it alone. Maybe because he already knew the shape of things, and pretending otherwise seemed wasteful. "After that, I don't know what I have." He was quiet for a moment. "I have money in my coat," he said. "You told me." "In the lining, there's a seam, lower left side of the coat." He paused. "I put it there because I was going somewhere I didn't fully trust, and I wanted something they wouldn't find in a quick search." Another pause. "They weren't that quick." Maeve looked at the coat, which was hanging by the door. She'd hung it there when she cut it off him, the coat-shaped evidence of what had been done to him. "How much?" she said. "Enough." "That's not an answer." "Enough to get your family through the winter," he said. "Enough for provisions and more. Enough that 3 days of flour isn't a cliff you're standing on anymore." She was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. The wind worked at the walls. "I don't want your money," she said. "You keep saying that." "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "I'm not offering you money. I'm telling you that you saved my life, and that there are resources available that could save your children's lives, and that it would be strange to call it anything except the right thing for you to take them." "What would you call it if I did take them?" "Payment of a debt," he said. "Simple as that." She stood up and crossed to his coat. She found the seam he described, lower left, inside the lining. She pressed it and felt the thickness of paper money through the fabric. She stood there with her hand on the coat, not moving, for a long time. Then she stepped back. "When you're well enough to tell me what you need from a town, I'll send Thomas," she said. "And I'll keep account of what's spent, and in the spring you'll tell me where to send repayment." "That's not necessary." "It is to me," she said. She went back to her chair. "Sleep, Mr. Blackridge. You've got another bad week of healing ahead of you, and your color is still terrible." A long silence. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "What?" "Thank you." She didn't answer, but she stayed by the fire longer than she needed to, and the arithmetic she ran in her head that night was different from the arithmetic she'd been running for 2 years. Less desperate, less a countdown, more like a problem that might actually have a solution. She was careful not to trust that feeling too much. She was careful, but she didn't entirely dismiss it either. Outside, the wind pressed itself against the cabin walls with its old, patient insistence. The creek lay frozen in the valley below, and in the small cabin on the ridge, a widow who had chosen mercy over survival sat by a fire that was, for the first time in weeks, warm enough. She didn't know yet what she'd brought home from the cold. She didn't know yet what it would cost her or what it would give her back. She only knew that she hadn't left him there, and that for tonight, at least, that was enough. The second week was harder than the first. The first week had been simple, in the way that emergencies are simple. There was a crisis, and you responded to it, and the responding took up all available space in your mind so that there was no room left for anything complicated. Maeve had been a nurse, a guard, a warden. Silas had been a patient. The roles were clear. But on the 8th day, he started getting up on his own, and on the 9th, he was moving around the cabin without holding on to things, and by the 10th, he was standing at the window for long periods looking out at the snow with an expression she couldn't read, and the simplicity was over. He was a man who took up space. Not physically. He was careful about that. Too careful, the way someone is when they're aware of being in someone else's territory. But in other ways, the way he listened when she spoke, with a quality of attention that she found unsettling because she wasn't used to it. The way he watched the children, not intrusively but present, noting things. The way he had opinions about how the fire should be banked that he mostly kept to himself but which occasionally escaped in the form of small actions, adjusting the damper, repositioning a log, that she noticed and did not comment on. Though the first time it happened, she felt a flash of something sharp and territorial that surprised her with its intensity. This was her fire. She had kept it going for 2 years without his assistance. She didn't say that. She understood it wasn't reasonable. But she felt it. "You do that again without asking," she said on the third occasion, her back to him, her voice carefully neutral, "and I'll put it back the way it was." A pause. "The draw's better this way. Less smoke." "I know how my chimney draws, Mr. Blackridge." Another pause, longer. "Fair enough," he said. He didn't do it again. That was the thing about him that she found most difficult to categorize. He pushed. She could feel it constantly. The low-level pressure of a man who is accustomed to having things done his way. But when he met genuine resistance, he stopped. Not gracefully, always. Not without that particular tightening around the jaw that she was learning to read as frustration held in check. But he stopped. And she wasn't sure whether that made him better or worse than a man who simply didn't notice the resistance in the first place. Thomas, predictably, had thoughts. He expressed them on a Tuesday morning when Silas was outside. He'd started going out for brief periods, testing his strength, against Maeve's advice and with her reluctant acknowledgement that she couldn't physically stop him. And Thomas said, with the directness that was his particular gift, "He's used to being in charge of things." "Yes," Maeve said. "Does that bother you?" She considered lying. Thomas was 9, but Thomas was also Thomas. "Some," she said. "He's not trying to be," Thomas said. "In charge of your things. He just forgets." "How do you know what he's trying to do?" "I watch him." He said it simply, like it was obvious. He watches himself too. After he does something, he thinks about whether he should have done it. You can see it in his face. He paused. "Papa didn't do that." Maeve stopped what she was doing. "What do you mean?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Papa was good," he said carefully. "But he didn't always think about whether what he wanted was what you wanted. He just thought they were the same thing." He picked up the rope he'd been working on. "This man thinks about it after." Maeve looked at her son for a long moment. "You're too old," she said. "You know that." "Probably," he agreed without a trace of self-pity. The door opened and Silas came back in, bringing cold and the smell of pine with him. He looked at the two of them and correctly read the quality of the silence as a conversation he hadn't been part of and didn't ask about. He went to the fire and held his hands out. "Temperature's dropping," he said. "Going to be a bad night." "It's been a bad month," Maeve said, and went back to work. The bad night he predicted came and was worse than predicted. A front moving in from the northwest that turned the cold into something aggressive and personal. Driving snow horizontal against the windows and finding gaps in the cabin chinking that Maeve had repaired in the fall, but that the season had apparently reopened. She spent 2 hours with Daniel's old chinking mix, clay and straw and horsehair, pressing it into the gaps while the children held candles, and Silas held the larger gaps shut with his body while she worked, bracing against the wall with his shoulder because his ribs still wouldn't let him do much that required his arms. They didn't talk while they worked. There wasn't time, and the wind was too loud anyway. But afterward, when the worst of the gaps were sealed and the cabin was marginally warmer and the children had gone to bed, Silas sat at the table across from her and said, unprompted, "I worked a cattle drive when I was 22, 3 months. Worst experience of my life." She looked up from the chinking she was cleaning off her hands. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Oh, because you're wondering who I am and you're too proud to ask," he said. "And I'm trying to, I don't know, make this less strange. It's already strange. Stranger then." He looked at the table. "I worked the drive because I had no money and no prospects and a lot of ideas about what I was going to do with my life and none of the means to do any of it. The cattle drive paid cash at the end. I took that cash and I went to Denver and I invested it in the most ridiculous long-shot thing I could find, which was a man with a plan to run rail track through mountain passes that nobody thought could be run. That was 18 years ago." She waited. "The track got built," he said. "And the man with the plan? Died of a heart attack 2 years in. I bought out his share from his widow." He said this without apparent awareness of how it might land, and then he saw her expression and said, "She wanted to sell. She got fair price, more than fair." "That's not what I was thinking," Maeve said, though it was partly what she was thinking. "You were thinking about widows," he said, "and what they're owed." She looked at him steadily. "What do you think they're owed?" "Whatever they've earned," he said. "Same as anyone." He paused. "Which is sometimes not enough and sometimes more than people expect." She pulled the candle closer and picked up her mending, which was the signal she'd developed over the past week for, "I'm not ending this conversation, but I'm not looking at you anymore," and Silas had picked up on it the way he picked up on most things. "The men who attacked you," she said. "They're connected to the railroad?" "To the land the railroad needs," he said. "There's a route through the valley, this valley, or near enough, that would cut 3 days off the mountain transit. Some people want that route to happen. Some people want to control it when it does. I'm somewhere in the middle." "Which side attacked you?" "Attacked." He was quiet long enough that she looked up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something measuring and careful, and also, underneath that, something that might have been shame if she'd had to name it. "I'm not entirely certain," he said. "That's the honest answer." "You don't know who your enemies are?" "I know who they probably are. I don't know who gave the order. And not knowing the difference is how you make the wrong move and make things worse." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I've been known to make wrong moves when I'm certain. When I'm uncertain, I prefer to wait." "That's either very wise or very cowardly," she said. "Probably both," he said. "At the same time, most things are." She found herself against her own preferences, almost smiling. She stopped it before it arrived. She didn't trust this man yet. She didn't fully distrust him either, which was its own uncomfortable position. "Sleep," she said. "You're not as healed as you think you are. I can see it in the way you hold your left side." He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "I've been watching you compensate for it all day. You'll reopen the stitches if you push." He closed his mouth. Then, "You are an extremely observant woman." "I'm a woman who's had to be," she said. "Good night, Mr. Blackridge." It was the closest thing to a companionable exchange they'd had. She lay in bed that night and thought about that, and then firmly stopped thinking about it, and eventually slept. The night passed. The wind dropped by morning. Life continued in the way it continued on the frontier, not with any kind of grace, but forward. It was 3 days after that when she found the rest of the money. She'd taken in his coat for repair. The lining had been cut when she'd removed it from him, and she'd been meaning to sew it back. Not out of any debt to him, but because a coat with a broken lining lost a significant portion of its warmth, and she was constitutionally unable to look at a fixable thing unfixed. She was working on the seam when she felt, through the heavy canvas, a thickness in the body of the coat that wasn't in the lining he'd already told her about. She stopped. She pressed her fingers along the length of the inner lining, slow and methodical. There was paper money in the lower left, as he'd said. But there was also something in the right side, stiffer and heavier than paper, and something else near the inside chest, which felt like a small cloth bag cinched with a drawstring, and which made, when she pressed it, a very faint sound that she recognized immediately because she'd heard it in her father's pocket when she was small, the sound he made when he bounced her on his knee. Coins. Gold coins, from the weight of it. More than a few. She sat still with the coat in her hands for a long time. Silas was outside. The children were in the back room. The cabin was quiet except for the fire. She put the coat down on the table. She looked at it. The flour had lasted longer than expected because she'd been more careful than she'd expected herself to be. But it was running out now, truly running out. She had perhaps 4 days left, less than that if Thomas and Clara ate enough to actually keep them warm in this cold. The dried beans were nearly gone. The 3 jars of pickled beets had been reduced to 1. She'd been calculating the food situation like a military problem every morning, and this morning the numbers had been bad enough that she'd sat at the table for a while before she could make herself stand up. The coat sat on the table in front of her. She picked it up. She put it back down. She pressed her fingers to the inside chest pocket again, feeling the weight of the coins through the fabric. It would be so easy. He might not even know. A man who had enough money hidden in various parts of a single coat might not track individual pockets with the kind of precision that would reveal a few missing coins. And she had 3 days of flour and 2 children, and the arithmetic had been bad this morning, bad enough to make her sit. Her hand was on the pocket. "Mama?" She turned. Clara was standing in the doorway to the back room, dark-haired and sleep-rumpled, holding Marie the doll. Looking at her mother with eyes that didn't miss much. "What are you doing?" Clara said. Maeve looked at her daughter. She looked at the coat. She stood up. "Fixing Mr. Blackridge's coat," she said. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. It's not nighttime anymore. Then get dressed and stay in the back room until I call you." Clara looked at her with the quiet evaluation she was so good at. Then she went back into the back room and pulled the door mostly shut. Maeve stood at the table. She picked up her needle and thread. She sewed the cut lining closed, neat and thorough, leaving everything where she'd found it. She did not take the coins. She did not let herself think about it once the decision was made. She had learned that particular discipline. You made the decision, and then you stopped revisiting it, because revisiting was just a way of tormenting yourself. When Silas came back in, she handed him the coat. "Fix the lining," she said. "You were losing warmth through the cut." He took it. He looked at it. He put it on, and she watched his hands unconsciously check the pockets in the fast automatic way of a man who'd been checking his pockets in that order for a long time. Right, left, chest, the brief pause over each one. He looked at her. "Everything's there," she said. "All of it." A silence moved through the room. Silas stood in the middle of the cabin with his coat on and looked at her with an expression that she couldn't fully catalog, something behind his usual careful composure, something that had the texture of a feeling he hadn't expected to have. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "There's coffee," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She poured the coffee. The exchange was over, or was over on the surface. Underneath it, something had shifted. In the way things shift when someone does the thing you didn't quite expect them to do. Neither of them mentioned it directly again. But the way he looked at her was different after that. Less measured. Less like assessment. More like something else that she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't sure she wanted one. The tension didn't go away. It never entirely went away. They were 2 people with strong ideas about things living in a very small space, and that was a permanent condition of friction regardless of what other things were also true. She snapped at him twice that week, once fairly and once unfairly. He said something about the way she'd shored up the lean-to that was technically a suggestion but had the delivery of a critique, and she told him flatly that the lean-to had survived 2 winters without his input and would survive this one too. And the argument that followed lasted about 8 minutes and ended with both of them retreating to separate parts of the cabin and not speaking for 2 hours. Thomas observed this with the expression of a man much older than 9 who was storing up material. Clara attempted to mediate by bringing both adults portions of the remaining pickled beets and saying, with perfect sincerity, "Marie says you should share food and feel better." Both Maeve and Silas looked at the beets, looked at each other, and looked away before either of them could do the thing that would have been most natural in that moment, which was laugh. "Tell Marie thank you," Silas said to Clara, and ate the beets. "She knows," Clara said. The cold stretched on. January ground itself down into the valley like something with a purpose. The family fell into a kind of rhythm with the stranger in their midst. Not comfort exactly, but accommodation, the shape of days that included 4 people instead of 3. Silas started doing what he could within the limits of his recovery. He couldn't swing an axe, but he could split smaller kindling with a hatchet if he was careful about it. He spent 2 hours one afternoon repairing the rabbit snares with a precision that was, Maeve admitted privately, better than the original construction, and the following week Thomas came in with 4 rabbits instead of the usual 1 or 2. She didn't comment on the snares. He didn't comment on not commenting. There was a conversation they were not having. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a piece of furniture in the dark. You know where it is, you move around it, you try not to walk into it. He was aware of it too. She could tell because of the same quality of deliberate avoidance that she employed herself. What she'd done with the coat, what she hadn't done, had changed something, and the gold watch, sitting in plain sight on the shelf where she'd put it the first day, was a different kind of statement every morning when they both saw it there. She'd had every opportunity to take it. She hadn't. He knew it. She knew he knew it. And underneath that, barely examined, she was starting to see him. Not just to categorize him, not just to assess what he cost her and what he might owe her, but to actually see him, the way he was with Clara, the particular patience he had for the girl's earnest conversations about the doll and the things the doll observed, which was a patience she hadn't predicted. The way he looked out the window sometimes with an expression so stripped of the usual composure that she felt like she'd seen something she wasn't meant to see and looked away. The way he'd said once, that first night he'd been truly conscious, "You should have left me," not as a complaint or a manipulation, but as a plain fact, and the way she'd understood that he meant it, and that he was a man who had somehow arrived at a point in his life where he thought that might be true. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her business. But she thought about it. On a gray Thursday, 10 days into his recovery, she came in from checking the snares to find him at the table with Thomas, and they were playing cards, a battered deck she kept in the drawer for bad days. Thomas was frowning at his hand with intense concentration. Silas was watching him with the expression he used when he thought no one was watching him, open, careful, something that looked almost like fondness. She stood in the doorway without announcing herself and watched for a moment. "You're thinking too much about what I have," Silas said to Thomas. "Think about what you have." "But if I know what you have, I can—" "You can't know what I have. You can make guesses about what I have, and those guesses are going to take you all over the place. Play what you hold." He tapped the table. "What's in your hand is certain. What you think is in mine is a story you're telling yourself." Thomas looked at his hand for another moment, and then made his play. Silas turned over a card. Thomas had won the hand. His face opened up into the expression he usually kept stored away, the grin that was entirely his own. "Play what you hold," he said. "Every time," Silas said. Maeve stepped inside. Both of them looked up. She went to the fire without saying anything, and there was no particular reason that a card game between a man and her son should have required any comment, so she didn't comment. But later, when Thomas was asleep and Clara was asleep, and it was just the 2 of them again in the firelight, she said without looking up from her work, "That was good advice. What you told him." A pause. "It's just cards." "It wasn't just about the cards." He didn't answer for a moment. Then, "No, it wasn't." She nodded. She kept working. The fire was good tonight, warm enough that she'd let it build higher than usual, burning through more wood than she should. But after 2 weeks of watching herself and everyone else, she was tired of being careful about everything. "He's a good boy," Silas said. He said it the way someone says a thing they've been holding on to for a while. Too direct to be casual, too quiet to be a statement of opinion. "I know," she said. "I don't mean it as a compliment to you. I mean it as a fact about him. He's, whoever he's going to be, it's already in him. You didn't put it there. It grew." Maeve set down her work. She looked at this man sitting across from her, this stranger who wasn't entirely a stranger anymore, with the firelight catching the gray in his hair and the lines of his face, and she thought, "Who taught you to say things like that?" "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked at the fire. Outside, the cold was what it always was. But in the small cabin, with the fire burning well and the children sleeping and the space between two people quietly rearranging itself into something neither of them had planned for, the night felt marginally less like something to be survived and slightly more like something to simply be inside of. She didn't trust the feeling. She'd learned not to trust things that arrived without warning, but she didn't push it away either. She let it sit. Just for tonight. She let it sit. The flour ran out on a Wednesday. Maeve had known it was coming, had known the exact morning it would happen, had been counting down to it with the grim precision she brought to all unpleasant certainties. But knowing didn't make it easier to stand at the kitchen shelf and look at the empty sack and feel the specific weight of that particular zero. She folded the sack and set it on the shelf. She stood there for a moment. Then she went and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Thomas came in from the cold with 2 rabbits from the snares, Silas's snares, rebuilt and repositioned 2 weeks ago, which had been producing better than anything she'd set herself and which she'd stopped feeling complicated about somewhere around the 3rd week. He looked at his mother sitting at the table with her hands flat and her eyes forward, and he understood immediately what the empty shelf meant. He set the rabbits down without comment. He sat across from her. "We have the beans," he said. "Half a sack," she said. "Maybe less." "The beets." "1 jar." He was quiet. He was doing the arithmetic, too. She could see him doing it, the same calculation she'd been running, adding up what they had against what they needed, and coming up with a number that didn't work. "Thomas," she said, "I need you to go to Harlow's trading post." He looked up. Harlow's was 15 miles east on the main road. She'd sent him once before in November, with $2 in a list. He'd come back half frozen and successful, and she'd spent the following week trying not to think about what could have happened on that road alone. "When?" he said. "Today. Early. You'd make it there before dark if you leave now." She stood up. "I'll write the list. Mr. Blackridge will—" She stopped. She'd been about to say, "Mr. Blackridge will give you the money," and the sentence had stopped itself in her throat because she hadn't actually talked to Silas about any of this. She'd been managing the food situation the way she managed most things, alone, in her head, making decisions and implementing them and not requiring anyone else's input. She went to the door of the lean-to, where Silas had been sleeping since he'd become mobile enough to want some separation from the family. She knocked on the frame. "I need to talk to you," she said. A pause. Movement. He came to the door, hair ungrouped and coat pulled on over his shirt. He'd been awake, she thought, just lying there doing whatever he did in his head in the early morning. There was a lot going on in that head. She'd become more certain of that as the weeks passed. He took one look at her expression and said, "How bad?" "Flour's gone," she said. "I need to send Thomas to Harlow's. I need—" She stopped again. The words were harder than she'd expected. "I need to use the money from your coat." He looked at her. She waited for some version of course, or "I told you so," or "I wondered when you'd ask." He said none of those things. "How much do you need?" he said. "I have a list. Give me the list." She'd written it that morning in her careful small handwriting, organized by priority: flour, salt, cornmeal, dried meat if they had it, sugar if there was any. She handed it to him. He read it. He folded it and held it. "This is half of what you need," he said. "It's what we need to get to spring." "Maeve!" He almost never used her name, just Mrs. Callahan, careful and formal, which they both understood was a kind of fence between them. When he said Maeve, she felt it as a deliberate thing, a choice. "You have 2 growing children in January in Colorado. This list doesn't have enough food on it. I know what my children need. I know you do. I'm saying you're not putting it on the list because you're counting something. What are you counting?" She looked at him for a long moment. "What I can pay back," she said. He made a sound that was not quite frustration, but was adjacent to it, a kind of exhale through the nose that she'd learned meant he was stopping himself from saying the first thing he thought of. She'd come to appreciate that habit in him, even when it irritated her, because the first thing he thought of was frequently blunt in a way that would have made the conversation harder. Let me give Thomas what he needs, he said. Not a loan, not a ledger entry. The food your family needs to get through the next 6 weeks. That's what I'm asking you to let me do. And what do you want for it? Nothing. He said it flatly, without decoration. I want nothing for it. You pulled me out of a snowdrift and stitched me up and fed me your last rabbits. There's no transaction here, Maeve. There's just... He stopped. There's just what's right. She looked away. The fire. The empty flower shelf. The folded sack sitting there. Add dried fruit to the list, she said. Clara needs it. Her gums have been bleeding. He nodded. He went back into the lean-to and came back with the small cloth bag from inside his coat. The coins she'd felt through the fabric 3 weeks ago and hadn't touched. He counted out what was needed and then more, and set the coins on the table. She looked at the coins. She looked at him. She picked them up. I'll keep account, she said. Maeve, I'll keep account, she said again, with enough firmness that he let it go. She needed to keep account. Not because she distrusted him, because she needed to be a person who kept account of things, who knew what she owed and to whom. If she stopped being that person, she didn't know who she'd be instead. He understood that, or he seemed to. He stepped back. Thomas left within the hour, bundled in every layer Maeve could pile on him, with the coins in an inside pocket, and the list and instructions, and a repeated warning about the creek crossing 3 miles east that sometimes had soft ice in this thaw-freeze pattern. He was 9 years old, and he set off across the snow-packed valley road like someone who'd been doing this kind of thing his whole life, which in a sense he had, and Maeve stood at the window and watched him go until the tree line swallowed him. He'll be fine, Silas said from behind her. I know he will, she said. She stayed at the window another minute anyway. The day passed slowly. Clara was fretful with hunger in the way she usually wasn't. She was generally a child who adapted without complaint, which Maeve knew was its own kind of worry. But today the small stomach was making itself known, and she was clingy in a way that 6-year-olds get when their body is telling them something is wrong. Maeve made a thin soup from the beans and the last of the dried herbs she'd put up in the fall and fed it to her in small portions through the afternoon, and Silas sat with Clara while Maeve worked, letting the girl lean against his arm and listening to her explain, at considerable length, Marie the doll's extensive opinions about winter. Marie doesn't like snow, Clara said. Most sensible people don't, Silas said. She likes the idea of snow. She just doesn't like the cold part. That's a very specific complaint. It's a very specific problem, Clara said, with the absolute seriousness of a child who had not yet learned that her logic could be amusing. If you could have the snow without the cold, that would be different. It would be an entirely different winter, Silas agreed. Clara considered this. Do you like winter? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that Maeve, who had been listening with half her attention, glanced over. I used to think I did, he said. I used to think it was just cold and manageable, something to get through. And now? Now I think I had no idea what winter actually was, he said. Clara looked up at him. Because of the snow you got left in? Partly, he said. And partly something else? He looked at the top of Clara's dark head for a moment. Partly something else, he said. Clara nodded, satisfied. She went back to adjusting Marie's yarn hair. Silas looked across the room at Maeve, who had been listening and now wasn't pretending not to. Their eyes met, and she looked away first, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who looked away first, and bent her head back to her work. Thomas came back at dusk, red-faced and triumphant and very cold, with a pack that was heavy enough that he'd had to adjust it twice on the road. He'd gotten everything on the list, and he'd found, at Harlow's, a piece of news that he delivered while Maeve was pulling the provisions out of the pack. Man at the trading post said there's been men through the valley asking questions, he said, working his frozen fingers near the fire. Asking about a man traveling alone. Big man with dark hair going gray. He paused. He described Mr. Blackridge pretty near exactly. Maeve stopped unpacking. She and Silas looked at each other. What men? Silas said. His voice had changed, not louder, not sharper, but different in a way that Maeve felt in her chest. The composure was still there, but it was working harder. Didn't say who they were. Harlow said there were 2 of them, came through 2 days ago heading west on the main road. Thomas looked at Silas with the steady gaze he used when he was delivering information he knew was serious. He told them he hadn't seen anyone. "Why'd he do that?" Silas said. Thomas shrugged. "He said you looked like a man who hadn't wanted to be found where you were. And if men were asking about you 2 days after they'd already tried something, then they probably weren't asking to apologize." He held his hands closer to the fire. "Can I have soup now?" "Yes," Maeve said. She was still looking at Silas. He was looking at the window, the darkness outside, the black space beyond the glass that could hold anything. "They'll be coming back east," he said. "If they went west and didn't find me, they'll retrace." "How soon?" "Day or 2. He turned from the window. "I need to send a message. There are people I can reach in Denver who can—" He stopped. "Do you have paper?" She got him paper. He wrote quickly and with the economical speed of someone who wrote a great many letters, 2 notes that she didn't read and didn't ask about. He folded them and sealed them and wrote names on the outside that she also didn't read. "If Thomas could take these to Harlow's in the morning," he said, "Harlow will know how to get them through. He's done it before." She took the letters. She set them on the shelf beside where the gold watch sat. She looked at the watch for a moment. "Silas," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without the formality of the last name attached, and it landed between them with a small particular weight. He noticed it. She saw him notice it. "What is actually going on? Not the version you've been giving me, the full version." He was quiet. Thomas was eating soup. Clara had drifted into the back room. The fire made its sounds. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from him. He looked at the table for a moment, in the way he did when he was organizing what he was going to say rather than avoiding saying it. Then he looked at her. "The railroad survey I told you about," he said. "The route through the valley. There are 3 men in Denver who have been trying to buy land options in this valley for the past year. Options they'd need to make worthless the claims of everyone already settled here." He paused. "Including yours." She felt something go cold and still in her chest. "My land." "Your land. The Beaumont place 15 miles east, 4 other homesteads between here and the main road. If those options go through and the railroad commits to that route, those families get forced out or bought out for a fraction of what the land will be worth." "And you?" she said. "Where do you stand on that route?" "I own a competing interest," he said. "A northern route that doesn't require displacing anyone. It costs more to build. The returns come slower. My partners in Denver—" He stopped. "Some of my partners want the valley route. Some want the northern route. The ones who want the valley route also, it seems, want me out of the conversation. So they tried to kill you. Kill. They tried to leave me where the cold would finish what they started, which is the kind of thing men do when they want to avoid being directly accountable for a death." He said it without particular emotion, like a man describing a business transaction he found distasteful but unsurprising. Maeve looked at him. At this man who had been in her cabin for 3 weeks, eating her food and fixing her snares and teaching her son to play cards, and who had been this whole time carrying the kind of trouble that didn't end with a knife wound in the snow. "They're going to come here," she said. "They're going to find me," he said. "Where I am when they do depends on what I do in the next 2 days. That's why you want the letters sent." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry. I should have told you all of this sooner. I wasn't sure how much danger came with the information, and I didn't want to bring that into your house." "It's already in my house," she said. "It's been here since I dragged you through the door." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry for that, Maeve. I mean it." She sat with it for a moment. The weight of the situation, the valley, the land where Daniel had put his arm around her shoulders and said, "We're going to build something here." Men in Denver making decisions about whose home was worth less than a railroad contract. Her son on the road to Harlow's carrying letters for a man who'd brought his war to her threshold without asking. "Are those men dangerous?" she said. "The ones who are looking? Dangerous enough. Would they hurt a family? Children?" He was quiet for a half-second too long. "I don't think they would. Harming a family would bring a kind of attention they don't want." He paused. "But I don't think I should be here when they come asking. It puts you in a position of lying for me or telling the truth, and either one is a problem. I can make my own decisions about that." "I know you can." He said it without argument. "I'm saying I'd rather not require you to make them. Thomas had finished his soup and was watching the two adults with the focused attention he brought to anything he considered important. When Maeve glanced at him, he didn't look away. "What does the watch mean?" Thomas said. Both adults looked at him. "You keep it on the shelf," Thomas said to Silas, "not in your pocket where it belongs. My mother put it there the first day and it's been there since. What does it mean?" A silence. Silas looked at the watch on the shelf. The gold case catching firelight, the engraved surface she'd turned in her hands in the cold by the creek. "Someone gave it to me a long time ago," Silas said. "Someone who thought I was worth believing in before I'd done anything worth believing in." He looked at Thomas. "Why?" "Because you look at it sometimes," Thomas said. "When you think no one is watching, and it looks like it costs you something to look at it." Silas studied the boy. "You're right," he said. "It does." He picked up the watch from the shelf, the first time Maeve had seen him hold it since she'd brought him in. He turned it in his hands. He opened it, looked at the face, closed it. Her name was Caroline. She was my wife. He set the watch down. She died 11 years ago. The room was quiet. Clara, who had apparently come back to the doorway without anyone noticing, said, "I'm sorry." "Thank you, Clara," Silas said. "Marie says people don't really leave," Clara said. "They just go where we can't see them." Maeve saw something move through Silas's face. A real thing, unguarded, there and then gone. "Marie's probably right," he said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back into the other room. Silas set the watch down and didn't look at it again. The next morning, Thomas took the letters to Harlow's at first light, and he was back by midday with a reply that had been waiting there, as if anticipated. A single sheet that Silas read and then held in the fire until it was ash. Whatever was in it changed something in him. He stood straighter. His eyes were clearer. He was making calculations of a kind that didn't involve this cabin or this valley. "My men will be here in 4 days," he said. "Maybe 5. "Your men," Maeve said. "People who work for me. Who've been looking for me." He looked at her. "After that I'll be able to leave. I can move safely when I have them with me." She nodded. She understood this was the conversation they'd been working toward for 3 weeks, the one where the temporary arrangement concluded. She told herself she was ready for it. She had been managing the arithmetic of this for days. She had the provisions Thomas had brought from Harlow's. She had the snares rebuilt. She had what she needed to get through. "Good," she said. That was all she said. She went back to work. But that evening, after the children were in bed and the fire was low and Silas was in the lean-to, she sat at the table with a candle and she took the gold coin she'd kept separate in a small tin, the ones she hadn't spent, accounting for what she'd used, and she counted them. She knew exactly how many there were. She'd counted them every day since Thomas brought the provisions back, because she was that kind of woman, the kind who counted things so she knew exactly what she had and exactly what she owed. She was putting them back in the tin when she heard him in the doorway of the lean-to. She looked up. He was watching her with that particular steadiness. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I was fixing your coat," she said, "before Thomas went to Harlow's, I found the coins through the lining. I felt them." He was very still. "I thought about taking some," she said. "I sat there and I thought about it seriously. We had 3 days of flour and my daughter's gums were bleeding and Thomas was trying not to let me see how hungry he was." She put the tin on the table. "I thought about it." "But you didn't," he said. "No." She looked at him. "But I want you to know that I thought about it, because you look at me like I'm someone who does things cleanly and without the ugly part in the middle, and that's not who I am. I want you to have the accurate picture." He came and sat down across from her, not rushing it, moving with the deliberateness he brought to things that mattered. "I know who you are," he said. "You don't. You've known me for 3 weeks. Long enough?" He looked at the tin. "Long enough to know that you told me this when you didn't have to. Which is the actual thing, Maeve. Not that you thought about it. Everybody thinks about it. The thing that matters is the telling." She looked at the tin. She looked at him. She said what she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. "Part of me wanted the watch. That first morning. I held it, and I thought about what it could buy. It would have bought you a month of provisions," he said, matter of fact. "Possibly 2. I know. And you put it on the shelf. I put it on the shelf. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the coins. What's in that tin? What I haven't spent. I kept a count. $12.40 used. The rest is there. He looked at the tin and then at her, and he did something she had not seen him do before, not in 3 weeks of close quarters. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested beside the tin. Not taking, not grasping, just setting his hand there, warm and deliberate. Keep it, he said. All of it, every dollar. Silas? You earned it, he said. Every cent. Not as a payment and not as a charity. You earned it the morning you chose to drag a stranger home instead of taking his watch and walking away. His hand was still on hers. I've done business with men for 20 years. I can count on 2 fingers the ones who would have done what you did. And I want to be honest with you about something. She waited. The valley, he said. The land you're on. The homestead. She felt the cold thing in her chest again. I hold the deed, he said. Through a land trust I set up 6 years ago when I first surveyed the northern route. I own this valley, Maeve. All of it, including the ground your cabin stands on. She took her hand back. She sat back in her chair. The candle between them threw shadows up the wall. You've been a guest in your own land, she said. Her voice was entirely level. She was proud of that. I've been a guest in your home, he said. That's different. The land and the home aren't the same thing. They are to me. I know. He held her gaze. I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you because I've been carrying it, and it's not honest to keep carrying it. You told me your hard thing. I'm telling you mine. That's not equivalent, she said. I kept your coins. You kept the fact that you own my land. You're right, he said. It's not equivalent. I held the bigger thing back. He didn't make excuses for it. He just said it. She sat with the information. The fire made sounds. Outside, January was still doing what January did, pressing its weight against everything, relentless and indifferent. She thought about Daniel saying, we're going to build something here, and she thought about the 2 winters she'd clawed through on that promise. And she thought about the gold watch and the coins and the letters burned to ash, and the men who were coming to find Silas Blackridge, and who would have to pass through this valley to get to wherever he was going. What are you going to do with the valley? She said. I haven't decided, he said. That's honest. Were you going to force anyone out? No. He said it without hesitation. The other men, the ones who want the valley route, they would. Yes. So right now, she said, the thing standing between my family and being forced off this land is the fact that the man who actually owns it was unconscious in a snowdrift when I found him. He was quiet for a moment. That's accurate, he said. She let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. It was the most involuntary sound she'd made in years. Something between incredulity and dark humor, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had managed one impossible thing only to discover it was resting on another impossible thing. Maeve, he said. Don't, she said. Let me sit with this for a minute. He waited. He was good at waiting, she had learned, better than most men who filled silences reflexively. He let silence be what it was. She sat with it. She looked at the candle. She thought about 3 weeks of thin biscuits and rabbit stew in his hand over hers on the table, and her daughter leaning against his arm, and her son learning to play what you hold, not what you guess. All right, she said finally. All right what? All right, I've sat with it. She looked at him. I'm still angry. That's fair? And I have questions. I know. And we're going to have a very different conversation when your men get here, and you have options you don't currently have. Yes, he said. We will. She picked up the tin of coins and set it on the shelf beside the watch, both of them there, in plain sight. She didn't know yet what they represented between them, whether they were debts or testimony or the beginning of some kind of accounting she didn't have words for. She only knew she wasn't putting them out of sight. Go to sleep, she said. Your color's still not right, and you've been favoring your left side again. He stood. He picked up the watch. He looked at it for a moment, just a moment, and she thought of Caroline, whose name he'd said once with a gentleness that was nothing like his usual self. He set the watch back down and left it there on the shelf. And that, she thought, watching him go, was the most honest thing she'd seen him do yet. They came on the 5th day. Maeve heard them before she saw them, horses on the valley road, more than 2, moving at a pace that was purposeful without being urgent. She was at the window before the sound fully resolved into something identifiable, and she stood there watching the tree line until 4 riders came through the gap where the road entered the valley. She'd been expecting trouble. She'd been holding herself at a certain level of readiness for 4 days since Silas had told her about the men asking questions at Harlow's, and that readiness had a particular texture. Not fear exactly, more like the state you got into before hard physical work, when your body understood something demanding was coming and began to quietly prepare. These riders weren't moving like trouble. They were moving like men who knew where they were going and had been sent there by someone who trusted them. She went to the lean-to anyway. "Riders," she said. Silas was already on his feet, already at the small window she'd cut in the lean-to wall the previous autumn for ventilation. He looked through it, and she saw his shoulders drop. Not collapse, just release, a subtle change in the tension he'd been carrying for days. "Mine," he said. He went outside without his coat, which told her how certain he was, and she followed him to the door and watched from the threshold. The 4 riders came into the yard, and the one in front, a lean man in his 50s with a weathered face and a gray beard trimmed close, pulled up his horse and looked at Silas for a long moment. "You look like hell," the man said. "Thank you, Garrett," Silas said. "You're about 5 days late. We were in Pueblo when the letter reached Denver. 4 days of hard riding to get here, which is the best we could do." The man called Garrett swung down from his horse and came forward, and the 2 men gripped arms in the way of people with a long history between them. Garrett looked at the cabin, at Maeve in the doorway. "This where you've been?" "This is where I've been." "And this is Maeve Callahan," Silas said. "She found me, brought me in, kept me alive." He said it plainly, without embellishment, and Garrett turned to look at her with the full attention of someone reassessing a situation. "Ma'am," he said, and touched his hat. "Garrett Hale. I've worked with Silas for 12 years. He looked back at Silas. "The men who did this, do you know yet who gave the order?" "I have a strong suspicion." "Donovan?" "Probably Donovan." Silas said the name with a flatness that contained a great deal of compressed feeling. "I want confirmation before I move on it." "We can get that." Garrett looked at the other riders. "Make camp in the tree line," he said to them. Then to Silas, "We need to talk." "I know," Silas said. He looked back at Maeve. "Can we—" "Come inside," she said. It wasn't warm exactly, the invitation, but it was genuine. She'd stopped doing warm for the sake of warmth a long time ago. The cabin was small with 2 additional men in it. Garrett came in and one of the other riders, a younger man introduced as Webb, who didn't say much and had the look of someone employed specifically for his usefulness in difficult situations. Clara pressed herself against Maeve's side when they entered and regarded the strangers with serious eyes. Thomas stood near the fire with the posture he adopted in uncertain situations, upright and watchful, positioned where he could see the room. Silas sat at the table, Garrett sat across from him. Maeve made coffee because it was what she did when she needed something to do with her hands, and because the situation called for the domesticity of it, the normalizing act of a hot drink in a room where serious things were being discussed. "Donovan moved on the land options while you were missing," Garrett said without preamble. "He's got 2 of the valley homesteads already tied up in dispute. Beaumont to the east is holding, but he's under pressure. How much time before those disputes go to arbitration? 6 weeks? Maybe 8? Silas looked at the table. He was doing that particular thinking she'd come to recognize, the kind that happened below the visible surface, where the real machinery was. "And the northern route financing? Still solid. Our Denver investors held." Garrett paused. "Barely. There was a week where nobody knew if you were alive, and some of them got nervous." "Who got nervous?" "Pierce Morrison." Silas made a sound. "Pierce I expected. Morrison surprises me." "Morrison has a wife who worries," Garrett said. "He's steadier when she's not paying attention to the papers." Maeve set coffee in front of both men and stepped back. She wasn't part of this conversation, and she wasn't pretending to be. But she was in her own kitchen, and she wasn't leaving it. Silas seemed to understand this. He glanced at her once, briefly, and there was something in it. Not apology, more like acknowledgement. She was part of the situation, even if she wasn't part of the business. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The valley route, he said to Garrett. If Donovan gets what he wants, what happens to the families here? Garrett was quiet for a moment. Buyouts at assessed value, which is low given the assessments were done by a man Donovan's people recommended to the county surveyor's office. So they get paid a fraction of what the land is worth and told to be grateful. More or less. Silas looked at the table, a long pause. Then he looked up at Maeve. The northern route, he said. Walk with me through something. She pulled out the chair at the end of the table. Daniel's chair, the one she never sat in herself, had never been able to sit in, and sat down. All right. If the railroad comes through this valley on the northern route, above the creek, following the ridge east, the grade is steeper but manageable. It adds cost to construction, but not enough to break the financing. He paused. It also means a depot, a supply point. And when you put a depot in a valley that's currently 3 days from the nearest town, you get a town, she said. Yes. She looked at him. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it for 6 years, he said. I've been thinking about this specific valley for 6 years. The land survey I did before I bought the trust. I walked this ground. I saw what it could be. He stopped. I also saw the families already on it and made a decision that the northern route was the right way to proceed. Not because it was more profitable, but because forcing people off their land for the convenience of a railroad company is the kind of thing I've watched other men do, and I've never been able to convince myself it was acceptable. Maeve looked at her hands on the table. Then at Silas. Then at Garrett, who was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who had seen his employer in a great many negotiations and was recognizing something different about this one. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing yet, Silas said. I want to be careful about this, Maeve. I've already told you things about your situation that you had a right to know sooner. I'm not going to sit here and offer you things in a way that feels like I'm using leverage I have because of the land. You're being careful because you're afraid I'll think you're buying my cooperation, she said. He looked at her directly. Yes. And are you? No? Then say what you have to say. He was quiet for a moment. Garrett looked at his coffee. Webb, in the corner, appeared to be studying the wall. I want to build this town right, Silas said. I built things wrong before. I've moved fast and built something that made money and left the people in it worse than before I arrived, and I've had to live with what that looks like 10 years down the road. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I need someone who knows this valley, who knows these families, who understands what a place like this actually needs from the ground up, not from a boardroom in Denver. He looked at her. I need a partner, not an employee. Someone with an equal stake in what gets built. The words sat in the room. Thomas, by the fire, had gone very still. Clara had stopped leaning against Maeve's side and was looking up at her mother's face. You don't know me, Maeve said. Not really. 3 weeks isn't... I know how you make decisions under pressure, he said. I know you don't take the easy thing when the right thing is available. I know you keep account of everything you owe, and you don't let pride stop you from asking for what you need, even though it costs you something to ask. He paused. Those are the things I need to know. The rest I can learn. She looked at Garrett. Is he always like this? Garrett considered the question with apparent seriousness. Honestly? No, he said. He's usually worse. He usually just tells people what's going to happen and expects them to catch up. He looked at Silas. This is better. Thank you, Garrett, Silas said, with a dryness that had the quality of something well practiced between them. Maeve stood up. She went to the fire and stood with her back to all of them for a moment, looking at the flames, and no one said anything. That was the thing about this cabin. She'd run it long enough that its silences were hers. Nobody filled them without her permission. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the way grief settled into the body over time, not disappearing but becoming part of the structure, the way a healed bone is sometimes stronger at the break. She thought about 2 winters of survival and the particular loneliness of doing hard things alone, not because you chose it, but because there was no one else. She thought about Thomas playing cards and Clara leaning against an almost stranger's arm and the snares rebuilt better than she'd built them. She turned around. Equal stake, she said, in writing, not a handshake. In writing, Silas said. Witnessed. The other families in the valley, Beaumont and the rest. Their land claims are protected, documented, non-negotiable. Agreed. And I have final say on anything that affects the families already here. If a decision would harm someone who was on this land before the railroad came, I have a veto. He looked at her for a moment. This was not, she understood, a small thing to ask. This was the kind of authority that men like Silas Blackridge did not typically distribute. She watched him think about it. Genuinely think about it. Not the performance of consideration, but the actual thing. On that specific category of decision, he said. Yes. Garrett made a small sound that was not quite a cough. You have something to add? Silas said without looking at him. Nope, Garrett said. Maeve looked at Silas. He looked back. This was the moment, she understood. Not a handshake, not yet, but the thing before a handshake where two people decided if they could actually bear to be accountable to each other for longer than a season. She thought about the watch on the shelf and the coins in the tin and the way he'd said, keep it, every dollar, you earned it, and how she hadn't known whether to believe him and had decided against her own caution to provisionally believe him, and how that decision had not yet proven wrong. All right, she said. He exhaled. It was the most unguarded thing she'd seen him do since the first night he was conscious, when the fever broke and he'd gone limp with the relief of it. All right, he said. Thomas made a sound from by the fire. Both adults looked at him. He was looking at his boots, but she could see from the set of his mouth that he was doing the thing he did when he was trying not to show too much. She'd know that expression in her sleep. Thomas, she said. I know, he said. I'm not saying anything. You don't have to. I know that too. He looked up, and there was the grin, the real one, the one that was entirely his own. He looked at Silas. Play what you hold, he said. Silas looked at the boy for a moment. Every time, he said. The riders who came for Silas made camp in the tree line as instructed and stayed 3 days while arrangements were made that Maeve did not fully understand and did not pretend to. Legal things, letters sent by courier back to Denver, documents that Garrett produced from a saddlebag that Silas read and annotated and sent back with Webb, who rode out on the second morning at a pace that suggested urgency. She stayed out of it. She had the provisions from Harlow's and the rebuilt snares and her children and a winter that was still 6 weeks from being over. She had enough to occupy herself without tracking the business of railroad men. But on the second evening, she came back from checking the snares to find Silas standing in the yard looking east, where the valley opened up toward the ridge line, and she stood beside him because the snares had been empty, and she was tired, and the view at dusk was the one thing about this land that had never failed her. The sky going orange and violet above the dark mountains, the snow-covered valley floor catching the last light, the creek a dark thread in the white. Tell me what you see, she said. He was quiet for a moment. A depot, he said. 200 yards east of the cabin, away from your garden. A main street running north to south, a schoolhouse. He stopped himself. I'm doing it again. Doing what? Getting ahead. Moving too fast. It's all right, she said. Tell me what you see. He looked at the valley for a moment, and she could see in his profile that careful thing loosening. The composure that was his default. The deliberate control. When he talked about what he saw in a place, something different came through. She'd noticed it the first time he'd talked about the northern route, the way his voice changed. A schoolhouse, he said. A general store that's actually stocked with what people need, not what's cheapest to ship. A doctor. There should be a doctor out here. There's nothing within 30 miles. Houses, real ones. Not just cabins people threw up to get through the first winter. Families who came west to build something and found something worth building. He paused. It takes 10 years, minimum. Probably longer. And it goes wrong 15 times before it goes right. And some of the things you plan don't work, and some of the things you don't plan are the ones that matter most. You've done this before, she said. Built a town. Part of one, he said. I made mistakes I wouldn't make again. What kind of mistakes? He thought about it. Moving too fast. Deciding what people needed before I asked them. Building the things that made money first, and the things people actually needed second. And telling myself the order didn't matter because eventually it would all get built. He was quiet. The order matters. What you build first tells people what you think they're worth. She looked at the valley. Orange light on white snow. The creek. The tree line. 300 yards from this spot, buried under 2 feet of snow, the place where she'd found him. A school first, she said. If you want to know what I think. A school first, he agreed, without hesitation. She felt something shift. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories, where a single moment carried the weight of everything. More the way ice shifted in early spring. A creak, a subtle change in the pressure. A suggestion that the surface that had been rigid for months was beginning, slowly, to remember it had another state. She was not ready to call it anything. She was constitutionally suspicious of things that arrived before she was ready for them. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, accurately, without flinching, without making it larger than it was. On the third morning, the riders prepared to leave. Silas came to find her in the kitchen, where she was making biscuits. Real ones now, thick and properly sized, because the flour from Harlow's was good, and she was no longer rationing herself down to paper-thin necessity. He stood in the doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand. She had known this was coming. She had been knowing it since the riders arrived. She had thought she was prepared for it. She kept making the biscuits. I'll be back in 6 weeks, he said. 8 at the outside. There are things in Denver that need to be dealt with in person, and I can't do them from here. I know, she said. The documents are with Garrett. Your copy is on the shelf. He nodded toward the shelf where the watch and the tin had been. The watch was gone. He'd put it in his coat that morning, finally, and she'd watched him do it without comment. The tin of coins was still there. Everything we agreed to is in there, drafted by Garrett, who is the most literal-minded man I've ever met, and who does not leave things to interpretation. Good, she said. Maeve. She looked up from the biscuits. He was looking at her with the expression she didn't have a name for. The one that wasn't composure and wasn't any of the things she'd cataloged in 3 weeks of watching him. It was something more unfinished than that. Something that hadn't fully decided what it was yet. This isn't over, he said. Not a promise exactly. More like a fact being stated for the record, the way he stated things when he wanted them to be unambiguous. I didn't think it was, she said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he put his hat on and went outside. She stood at the counter with her hands in the biscuit dough, and she listened to the sounds of horses, men's voices, the jingle and creak of departure. She listened to Thomas go out to watch them go and come back in a few minutes later. She listened to Clara ask where Mr. Silas was going and Thomas tell her Denver, and Clara say that was very far, and Thomas say yes, it was. She made the biscuits. They were the best she'd made all winter, properly thick, properly risen, the kind of biscuits that the flour and the time and the temperature conspired to make when everything lined up. She stood at the oven and looked at them and thought, with a humor that was entirely private, of course they are. She put them on the table. She called the children. They sat down and ate, the 3 of them, in the cabin that was theirs, on the land that was hers, legally committed in writing on a shelf by a man who was somewhere on the road east, and the biscuits were good, and the fire was warm, and outside the Colorado winter was still doing what Colorado winters did. But at the ridge to the east, if you knew where to look, you could see where the snow had been disturbed by the passage of horses, the faint line of tracks that followed the valley's natural grade, the path that a railroad might follow if a man in Denver held his nerve and did what he said he would. Maeve didn't look. She had work to do. But she knew it was there. 6 weeks came and went, and Silas did not return. Maeve had expected this. She had told herself she expected this, in the careful way she managed expectations, setting them low enough that reality couldn't surprise her too badly, high enough that she wasn't being dishonest with herself. 6 weeks, he'd said. 8 at the outside. She'd written both numbers down in the small account book she kept, the same one where she'd tracked every dollar of his money spent, and she'd noted the date of his departure and counted forward. 8 weeks landed on a Tuesday in late March. On Wednesday, she went out to check the snares, his snares, which she'd maintained exactly as he'd set them, and found them empty, and stood in the early spring air that was warmer than anything she'd felt since October, and she thought, he's not coming back. She stood there for a while. The creek was beginning to move under the ice. She could hear it, a faint sound of water finding its way back to itself, working against the cold that had held it all winter. The snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes. brown grass and old leaves visible in patches, the world in the process of changing state. She went back to the cabin and made breakfast and said nothing to the children about any of it. Thomas knew anyway. He watched her the way he always watched her, with that particular careful attention that had been his father's gift and his own burden. And at breakfast he said, without looking up from his plate, "The road's still bad. Even if he wanted to come, the road south of Harlow's was washed out last week. Hector Beaumont's boy said so." She looked at her son. "When did you talk to Hector Beaumont's boy?" "When I went to check the eastern snares." He met her eyes. "He said the courier from Denver had been delayed 2 weeks already. Said it's bad going everywhere right now." She held his gaze for a moment. He was 9 years old. He had the instincts of someone twice that. "Thank you," she said. "I'm just telling you what I heard," he said, and went back to his breakfast. Silas came back on a Thursday, 5 days later, 9 weeks and 2 days after he'd left, which was outside the outside number, but not by so much that it had crossed from late into something else. Maeve was splitting kindling in the yard when she heard the horses, and she straightened up and turned and saw him coming through the valley road gap with Garrett beside him and 3 other riders she didn't recognize. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. Then she bent back down and kept splitting kindling, because the kindling needed splitting, and she was not a woman who made a performance of relief. He dismounted and walked across the yard and stopped a few feet away. She split 2 more pieces before she stood up again. "You're late," she said. "The south road washed out," he said. "We had to come around through Thomas told me about the road," she said. 9 weeks and 2 days. He absorbed this. "You counted." "I count everything," she said. "You know that." She looked at him properly now, at his face, which was tired in the specific way of someone who'd been dealing with hard things for a sustained period, the lines deeper than she remembered. Something worked through in his eyes. "Did you get it sorted?" "Most of it," he said. "Donovan?" "Handled." He said it in a way that ended the subject, and she let it end because some subjects were better finished than examined. The land options he'd filed are voided. The families here are protected. The northern route financing is committed. We broke ground on the eastern section 2 weeks ago. He paused. "I also had a meeting with a man named Arbuckle, who is the best railroad depot architect west of Chicago, and I'd like you to look at what he drew up." She looked at him. "You had him draw up plans before we'd agreed on the details." "I had him draw up options," Silas said. "Not plans. Options. There's a difference." "Is there?" "The options are starting points. You tell him what's wrong with them, and he draws something else." He held her gaze. "I told you I moved too fast before. I'm trying to do it differently this time." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Garrett, who was pretending to be very interested in the middle distance. "Did he tell Arbuckle what the depot would look like before or after he talked to me?" she said to Garrett. Garrett's jaw worked. "That's a complicated question," he said carefully. "Before," Silas said. "I told Arbuckle what I thought it should look like before I talked to you. Then I looked at the drawings and realized I'd made certain assumptions about what the community would need that I hadn't actually confirmed with anyone who lives here. And I told Arbuckle to draft 3 alternatives based on different priorities." He paused. "One of the alternatives starts with the school." She was quiet for a moment. She picked up the kindling she'd split and set it against the woodpile with more care than it strictly required. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten since Denver." He hadn't, it turned out. Not properly. He'd been riding hard for 4 days. She made food, real food, the kind she could make now with a well-stocked larder and spring coming, and he ate at her table with the focused attention of someone whose body had been given something it needed. And across from him, Thomas showed him the 2 rabbits he'd taken that morning and explained in considerable technical detail the adjustments he'd made to the snare positioning. And Silas listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything Thomas said. Genuine, unhurried, like the boys' observations were worth the time they took. Clara came in from the back room, took one look at Silas, and said with complete matter-of-factness, "You came back." "I came back," he said. "Marie said you would," Clara said. "I wasn't sure." "What made Marie sure?" Clara thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. "She said a man who leaves his watch behind always comes back for it." Silas looked at the shelf. The tin of coins was there, exactly where it had been, But the shelf was otherwise bare. She kept it, Thomas said, without looking up. In the drawer, in case. Maeve, at the stove, kept her back to all of them. She heard Silas not say anything, which was louder than most things people said. The drawings Arbuckle had made were spread on the table after dinner, when the children were in bed and the lamp was turned up, and the two of them sat on opposite sides of the table like the business partners. The documents on the shelf said they were. Maeve looked at each sheet carefully, the way she read everything. Thoroughly, without hurrying, without pretending to understand things she didn't, and asking when she didn't. The first option was the largest and the most ambitious. Depot, Main Street, a full grid of residential plots, a hotel, a bank. Too fast, she said. He nodded. That's what I thought when I looked at it again. A bank before a doctor is... That's a statement about what you think this town is for. Yes. What's the second one? The second was more modest. Depot, a main commercial street, residential plots on the north side, a schoolhouse positioned at the head of the street. She looked at it for a long time. The schoolhouse is in the right place, she said, but the residential plots are too uniform. People who've been building their own places don't want to be handed a lot like a city block. They want ground they can work. So the plots need to be larger and irregular. Let people negotiate the boundaries to fit their land. She traced a line on the drawing. The Beaumont place is here, roughly. Hector's going to want his eastern field left alone. He's been putting work into that soil for 4 years. If the main street comes through this way, it cuts him off from the creek access he needs for irrigation. She looked up. Did anyone walk the actual ground before drawing this? Silas was quiet for half a second. Arbuckle worked from the survey maps. Survey maps drawn before anyone was living here, she said. I'll walk it with him. Before anything is finalized, I need to walk it with him and show him where the families are actually situated. I'll arrange it. And I want to talk to the other families before anything is announced publicly. They deserve to hear what's coming from someone they know, not from a stranger on a horse. Agreed. He was watching her with something that might have been satisfaction, if satisfaction were a quieter feeling than it usually got credit for. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're good at this. I'm good at thinking about consequences, she said. That's different from being good at building things. It's the part most people who build things skip, he said, which is why most things get built wrong. She looked at the drawings for another minute. Then she rolled them carefully and set them aside. The Donovan situation, she said. You said handled, but there are people in Denver who wanted the Valley route and didn't get it. Those people don't stop wanting things because illegal filing got voided. No, he said. They don't. So what keeps them from trying again? From finding a different angle? He looked at her steadily. The fact that there's nothing left to try, he said. The land trust is converted to a development partnership. Yours and mine, equal and documented. The northern route is committed and funded. The families here have recorded claims that are ironclad. There's no version of events now where the Valley route becomes viable for Donovan's people because the partnership controls the land, and we've gone on record with the county and the territorial government about our intentions. He paused. Donovan can be angry. He can't be effective. And the men who actually hurt you? A pause. 2 of them have decided to pursue opportunities in California, he said. The third is in a situation that makes pursuing any opportunities difficult for the foreseeable future. She held his gaze. You didn't? I didn't, he said. I had enough on him through other means, legal means, just barely. He looked at the table. I thought about it. I won't pretend I didn't. He looked up. But doing things that way makes you into a version of the thing you were fighting against. And I've watched that happen to men I started out respecting. I'd rather be slower and keep my shape. She thought about a man lying in the snow in the dark, alone, left to die, not by a knife, but by the cold that the knife was supposed to deliver him to. She thought about what that did to a person, what it would do to her, if she survived it, whether she would come out of it with her shape intact. That's the right choice, she said. I know, he said. It didn't feel like it at the time. The right choices usually don't, she said. That's how you know they're the right ones. He looked at her. She looked back. The lamp made its small sound. Outside, the creek was louder now than it had been all winter. She could hear it from inside the cabin, the sound of water fully released from ice, running strong and fast in the dark. "Maeve," he said. She waited. "I need to ask you something that isn't about the railroad or the valley or the legal arrangements." He said it carefully, with the precision he brought to things he'd thought about for a long time. "And I want to be clear that the answer doesn't change any of those things. The partnership stands regardless. That's not a negotiating position. It's just true." "Ask," she said. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. "I don't want to go back to Denver and come back in 6 weeks and leave again," he said. "I don't want to do this from a distance, managing it through letters and couriers and riding in when there's a problem. I want to be here." He paused. "I want to be here in a way that means something beyond the business arrangement." She was very still. "I know the timing is—" He stopped. "I know there's no good way to say this that doesn't sound like I'm moving fast, which is the thing I've been trying not to do. And I know that you've been managing your life alone for 2 years and you're not looking for someone to manage it with you, because you've already proven you don't need that." He looked at the table again. "I'm not offering to manage anything. I'm saying I'd like to be here, if that's something that could be part of what we're building, eventually. On your timeline, not mine." She sat with it. The fire, the sound of the creek, the lamp. She thought about this morning she'd folded the empty flour sack and sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. She thought about Daniel and the aspens turning gold and the weight of grief that didn't leave but changed, the way water changed, ice to river, one state to another, the same thing wearing a different shape. She thought about a man lying in the snow and the choice she'd made that she'd been making sense of ever since. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I've noticed," he said without irony. "I have opinions about how things should be done and I say them, and I don't soften them to be agreeable, and that's not going to change." "I know. My children are the first consideration, before the railroad, before the partnership, before any of this. If something is wrong for them, it doesn't happen." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. And the thing was, she believed him. She'd believed him in the small ways for weeks now, the accumulated weight of small true things, and this was the large version of the same thing. "Your timeline," he said again. "Not mine." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who was not easy, who moved fast and corrected himself and held his coat pockets while she watched and taught her son that what you hold is more certain than what you guess, and told her daughter that Marie was probably right about people who were gone. This man who was too much in certain ways and had tried, imperfectly, to be less. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "Real spring, when the ground is thawed and I can see what we're actually working with." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face loosened. Not relief exactly, but the thing that comes before relief. When you've been bracing for something and the bracing turns out to have been for less than you feared. "All right," he said. "And don't ask before I'm ready," she said. "I'll tell you when I'm ready." "All right," he said again, and there was something in the way he said it the second time. Simpler, steadier, like a man who had learned to play what he held. Real spring came slowly, the way it always came in the mountains, grudging and irregular. 2 warm days followed by a cold snap, mud and ice existing together in an uncomfortable negotiation, the aspens budding in the lower valley while the high ridge still carried snow. But it came. By the middle of April, the creek was fully running, loud and brown and reckless with snowmelt, and the south-facing slope above the cabin was green with new grass, and Maeve's garden, which she'd been planning on paper all winter, larger this year, more ambitious, was ready to be turned. She walked the valley with Arbuckle, the architect, on a Tuesday in April. He was a small, precise man from Chicago who wore a coat that was wrong for the weather and took notes in a leather book and had the quality of listening that good builders have, not agreeing with everything, but actually hearing it. She showed him where Hector Beaumont's irrigation lines ran. She showed him the natural slope of the land that would make certain street orientations sensible and others difficult. She showed him where the children in the valley, on the rare occasions they could reach each other, had worn a path through the grass between 2 homesteads, a path that had no official existence, but had been made by feet and necessity and the human desire to move toward other people. "Put the road there," she said, pointing at the path. "Not where a grid says it should go, where people already walk." Arbuckle wrote it down without argument. "That's good thinking," he said. "It's just watching," she said. "Most good thinking is." She talked to the other families before any public announcement. She rode to the Beaumont place first, on a morning when the air was cold and clean, and the valley looked the way it looked in her best memories of it, and she sat at Hector Beaumont's table and told him what was coming plainly, and answered his questions honestly, including the ones she didn't have answers to yet. She told him his land was protected. She showed him the documents. She told him what the town could be if they built it right, and what it could fail to be if they didn't. Hector was a careful man, slow to trust, who had been farming this ground for 6 years and had the suspicion of someone who'd watched other men's promises come and go. He listened to everything she said, and then he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "You're sure about this man?" She thought about it, the honest version. "I'm sure about the documents," she said. "The rest, I'm provisionally sure, which is the most I'm ever sure about anything." Hector looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Provisionally sure is more than most people give you," he said. "All right." By the time the ground survey was finished and the first formal plans were filed with the territorial office, it was May. The aspens were fully leafed. The creek had settled from its frantic spring volume into the clear, steady running of early summer. Thomas had turned 10 and was, if anything, more serious than he'd been at 9, which Maeve found both admirable and slightly alarming. Clara had begun calling Silas by his first name without the Mr., which she'd been doing since March, and which Silas had not corrected and Maeve had not addressed, because some things sorted themselves out without intervention. The first building went up in June. The schoolhouse, positioned exactly where the document said it would be, at the head of the main street that followed the old footpath through the grass. Plain timber construction, 4 windows, a small bell that Maeve had ordered from Denver specifically, and that arrived wrapped in cloth and packed in straw. She'd paid for the bell herself, out of her share of the partnership's first expenditures. Silas had noticed the separate accounting for it and said nothing. She'd noticed him noticing and said nothing either. The day the schoolhouse frame was raised, half the valley showed up. Hector Beaumont and his family. The Reardon family from the North Claim. 3 homesteaders Maeve barely knew who'd heard what was happening and come to see. 2 of Silas's workers who'd been living in canvas tents at the survey site, and who looked faintly astonished to find themselves building something rather than just measuring it. It was not a ceremony. Nobody made speeches. There was no formal moment where everything changed. People just showed up with their hands and their tools, and they raised the frame in a day, working through the afternoon into the early evening when the light was long and gold, and when the last timber was set and the thing was standing, rough and unfinished, and nothing close to what it would eventually be, but standing. Somebody in the crowd let out a sound that wasn't quite a cheer, but was something. And then others made the same sound, and it became something that echoed off the ridge. Maeve stood at the edge of it and watched. Thomas was on the frame. He'd been up there for 3 hours, passing tools and holding joints and learning things she couldn't have taught him, and she watched her son on the high timber with his father's hands and his own particular seriousness, and she felt the full weight of everything. The 2 winters, the flower counted in her palm, the watch she'd held by the frozen creek, the impossible choice that had not felt impossible in the moment, because in the moment there had been no choice at all, only what she could live with afterward. Silas came and stood beside her. Not close, just near. They watched the frame in the evening light. "You built this," he said. "We built it," she said. "The part that matters," he said quietly. "The part that makes it more than just a building. That's you. You're the reason Hector Beaumont sat across a table from me without walking out. You're the reason people showed up today. I have money and legal documents. You have something that doesn't have a name in a contract." She looked at the schoolhouse frame, the ridge behind it, the valley that was changing state, the way water changed state, not losing what it was, but becoming something it also was, something it had been waiting to be. "It has a name," she said. "It's just not a business word." He looked at her. She looked back. "Ask me," she said. He understood immediately. She could see it in his face, the shift from stillness to something more alive. "I thought you were going to tell me when you were ready," he said. "I'm telling you," she said. "Ask me." He turned to face her fully. He was not a man who did things halfway when he did them, which was one of the things that most exhausted her about him and most drew her to him. He looked at her the way he looked at things he'd made a decision about, completely, without the hedging that smaller decisions got. "Stay," he said. "Build this with me. Not just the town, All of it. He paused. Be here in a way that means something. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who was not Daniel and was not anything she'd planned for, and who had arrived in her life the way serious things often arrived, uninvited, inconvenient, and impossible to dismiss. She thought about what she'd told Hector Beaumont. Provisionally sure is the most I'm ever sure about anything. Yes, she said, not breathlessly, not with tears. Just yes. The honest, considered, full-weight version of the word, the kind that you say when you mean it all the way down. He didn't reach for her hand. He just stood there with the yes between them. And after a moment he nodded, like a man receiving information he'd needed to confirm before he could proceed. And then he looked back at the schoolhouse frame in the evening light, and she looked at it too. And Thomas came down from the timber red-faced and dirty and proud. And Clara appeared at Maeve's side from somewhere and took her hand without asking. The four of them stood there while the light changed and the valley settled into evening. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't going to be perfect. There were things that would go wrong in the months and years ahead. Buildings that didn't come together right, decisions she and Silas would fight about at length, moments when the distance between two people who had formed themselves independently proved difficult to cross. She knew this about herself. She knew it about him. Neither of them was the kind of person who made things easy. But the schoolhouse stood, and the creek ran clean, and the valley that had tried to kill all of them in different ways at different times was changing into something else, slowly and imperfectly, the way real things change. The widow who had once counted flour in the dark and the man she'd pulled from the snow had started with the worst version of a winter. They were building, from that, something that might outlast both of them. Not because it was a story that deserved a good ending, but because they'd done the work, made the choices, held to the things worth holding. And sometimes, not always but sometimes, that is enough to make the ending good. The bell for the schoolhouse arrived the following week. Maeve hung it herself. When she rang it for the first time, the sound carried the length of the valley and beyond, bright and clear above the trees. And in the years that followed, it would be the sound that people remembered when they remembered how the town began. Not the day the railroad came, not the day the first building went up, but the particular morning in early summer when a bell rang in the mountains and something that had been just land became, unmistakably, home.